listening to Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn and Company. I am your host, Tim Dooner. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'm driving solo. It's getting near the end of the summer. NFL preseason is in full force. And if you're like me, and you watched that historic 5-0 Browns preseason game, then you're likely well rested. Staying with history, I wanted to do something a bit different this episode. Something I used to do quite often on my previous show, The Shipping Pod. And that's historical deep dives into industry-changing events, inventions, and innovations. So that brings us to today, and we're going to take a look at the history of the semi-truck. If you'd like to read our accompanying article on the history of the semi-truck, head on over to our blog at abornandco.com/blog. That's abornandco.com/blog. And if you're looking for this podcast, or if you'd like to catch our past episodes, simply visit abornandco.com/podcast. Now, on to our main feature, the history of the semi-truck. Aside from electricity, it could be argued that no greater 19th century invention shaped shipping in the United States of America more than the semi-truck. Predating airplanes and interstates, semi-trucks allowed American farms and businesses to sell beyond their borders in ways that trains simply could not. In fact, semi-trucks are still such an integral part of the American economy that they haul over 70% of the goods that we consume. So, where did the semi-truck come from? And how is it kept up with technology to evolve into the dominant force in shipping that it is today? Well, prior to the invention of trucks, freight was hauled by horse-drawn carriages and trains. Railroads were highly efficient at moving large amounts of cargo, but could only deliver those goods to centralized urban centers where the train stations were. While this helped grow urban areas, it fundamentally limited the growth of rural areas and even towns located just miles away from city centers. That was until 1896, when Scottish immigrant Alexander Winton, owner of the Winton Bicycle Company, shifted his focus from pedals to engines. He initially experimented with single-cylinder automobiles before starting his own car company. Well, in 1897, the Winton Motor Carriage Company was incorporated, and they launched with a series of handcrafted automobiles. Each vehicle had ornate exteriors with exquisitely hand-painted sides, as well as padded seats, a leather roof, and gas headlamps. You'd be the talk of the town driving in one of these, and they rolled on top of B.F. Goodrich tires. Winton himself, he was a firm believer that auto racing was the way to market his vehicles. So in May of that year, Winton showed off his 10-horse-powered model with a race around a Cleveland horse track. There, it impressed onlookers after being clocked with a track speed of 33.64 miles per hour. Yeah, that was wicked fast back then. But despite that wicked fast track time, critics were still concerned about the practicality of the automobiles. To assuage his doubters, Winton ordered an endurance run that saw his car make the 800-mile drive from Cleveland to New York City. The marketing worked, and just over a year after launching his car company, Winton made his first sale to Robert Allison of Port Carbon, Pennsylvania. Winton would go on to sell 21 more cars that year at a list price of $1,000. That's roughly $30,000 in today's dollars, so really actually not that bad to get into one of these Winton automobiles. You know, I'm thinking about the financing right now. Can I lease one? And these cars too, the Wintons, if you've never seen one, well actually I'm sure you have. They look like the old-fashioned chitty bang bang style of car. They really do look like the merger between a car and a carriage in that natural progression. Well, that old-fashioned style, that's a Winton. That's what you're looking at most likely. By 1899, Winton would sell more than 100 cars, making his company the largest manufacturer of gas-powered automobiles in the USA. However, due to the success of the Winton automobile, the company was faced with a whole new problem. and that was how to get their car to buyers. Some spread out across the entire country, and he wanted to get the cars to them without adding significant wear and tear to the vehicles, which would happen if you were to drive them directly to them. And you have to be mindful, too, of the roads at this time. We didn't have the interstate yet or the highways, so we're talking about a lot of rural roads and impassable areas that a delicate vehicle like this would just not be able to make it through without incurring massive amounts of damage or maintenance or wear along the way. So to solve this problem, Winton built the first ever auto hauler. This worked by converting a standard Winton automobile into a tractor and then attaching a trailer to the rear which could pull one car at a time. And with that, we had the very first semi-truck, a car puller. In 1903, a Winton automobile made the first successful drive across the U.S. as Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson made the trek from San Francisco to Manhattan in, get this, 63 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. Since interstate highways didn't yet exist, this was quite the trip that often saw Jackson and his passenger, which was wisely selected, he picked a mechanic to go along with him. They were driving miles out of their way to get past these impassable roads and over this terrain. They even needed to use a series of pulleys, horses, and good old-fashioned sweat equity to hoist the car over rocks and pull it free from sand. By 1910, improvements in engines, transmissions, and expanded roadways gave rise to the popularity of shipping via truck. By 1914, there were over 100,000 trucks. At this point, there were so many trucks in operation that 4 states enacted the very first weight limits for semis, which ranged from 18,000 pounds to 28,000 pounds. Still, solid tires, a lack of practical trailers, poor rural roads, and a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit kept trucks confined to short-haul urban routes. Well, it was the need to move cars that saw the development of the first semi-truck. It was a rich guy with a boat that had to get to Michigan whose order for a trailer began production on what would eventually become the modern semi-trailer. It was 1914 that Frederick M. Sibley asked August Charles Freyhoff to build a trailer for his Ford Model T that would pull the businessman's boat. In fact, Sibley was so impressed by Freyhoff's work that he then commissioned him to make trailers for his lumberyard, thus starting this business, starting this industry, this semi-trailer industry. Freyhoff, he was a blacksmith and a carriage maker by trade. He began the Freyhoff Trailer Company in 1918 to meet all of these new orders and demands for his trailers. Industries like dairy, lumber, and fuel oil took notice of these go-anywhere trailers almost immediately. Their original marketing campaign gave birth to the slogan, "A horse can pull more than it can carry, so can a truck." Freyhoff trailers would eventually see action in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. During this period of extreme success, the company would hold over 150 military patents. Like most industrial technologies, a wartime need rapidly aided in the development of long-haul trucking. Congestion on the railroads highlighted the need for alternative modes of transportation to move cargo. During these war years of 1914 to 1918, World War I, Roy Chapin began work on the development of long-distance trucking shipments. And what Chapin soon realized were that trucks could travel much further on inflatable tires as opposed to the solid ones that trucks currently were using. Concurrently, 2 truck manufacturers would rise to prominence by 1920. That was the White Motor Company and Mack Trucks. By the start of the 20s, there were over 1 million trucks on the roadways. Through the decade, a number of improvements would go a long ways in increasing the proliferation of the truck. Diesel engines increased fuel efficiency by 25 to 40% over gasoline engines. Truck and trailer sizes started adhering to standards, and power-assisted steering and brakes were developed. By 1933, trucks would become so common that all states had some form of truck weight regulation. Trucking would undergo a number of refinements and changes in the ensuing years, but none were as impactful as what would occur in 1956. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 was the first step in connecting the country. Enacted by President Eisenhower, the bill authorized $25 billion, which is roughly $232 billion in today's money, for the construction of over 40,000 miles of interstate highway over a 10-year period. It was the largest public works project in American history up until that time. The act also included the first set of federal maximum gross vehicle limits for trucks, which capped at 73,280 pounds. Just as the Federal Highway Act was breaking ground on America's freeway system, Malcolm McLean introduced his revolutionary new shipping container. This standardized metal box would change the way modern containerized intermodal shipping would be handled from then on. And this, what McLean had standardized was, your typical 40 and 20-foot container that you see in ocean shipping and on the back of trains, and it could also be pulled by truck trailers. It allows trains, trucks, ships to all use similar equipment for transporting the same loads. This dramatically increased efficiencies and allowed for fluid transfer between multiple modes of transportation. It wouldn't be until the 1970s, when trucking hit Hollywood, that life behind the wheel of a big rig became synonymous with cool. With over 18 million trucks on the road, Americans took notice and gave rise to trucker culture.
What's your 20? About 16 miles this side of Mississippi. Whoa, hold it. I just passed another Kodiak with a Kodak. This place is crawling with bears. Where the hell are you? Come back. I'm still trying to get rid of that Texas County Mountie. I don't know what the hell he wants. You know what he wants. I mean, how would you like to be the dude that handcuffs a legend?
Seen as lone wolf outlaws, renegades, and freebirds, truckers found their niche amongst an interested public. Smokey and the Bandit and songs like Convoy rose to the top of the box office and Billboard charts. What's your 20? Even CB radio slang became popular enough to find its way into everyday conversation. Unfortunately, though, by the end of the decade, things would change. The 1979 energy crisis availed the favor that truckers had just received from a once endearing public. A series of violent protests and strikes, as well as changing cultural dynamics, would push the mainstream perception of truckers back into the shadows. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 deregulated the trucking industry and opened the floodgates for the number of companies that could operate as carriers. This, along with rapid deunionization, ultimately hurt driver pay. The public spotlight moved on, and truckers were now relegated to horror movies where they're portrayed as sociopathic, road-raging highway stalkers. And if you go back and listen to episode 5, I had a great conversation with our veteran trucker on the street, our correspondent, Paul Charles, about movies like Joyride. And I know Over the Top is probably one of the only positive portrayals of truckers in the 80s, 2000s, and currently. They don't get a lot of love on the screen. By this point, trailers had undergone their own evolution. This was due to the use of standardized shipping pallets. The typical North American grocer's pallet is 48 inches long by 40 inches wide. As trailers grew in size, they would often do so at multiples of 4 feet. So for a long time, the 48-foot dry van was the de facto standard in shipping due to regulation which limited the overall length of the vehicle to 75 feet. Once those regulations were changed, though, the industry adopted what you see most commonly now, which is the 53-foot trailer. Those have room for 13 rows of pallets, plus an extra foot so that the door will close once they're all in there. Last year, the ELD mandate went into effect, causing an industry-wide uproar. This has spurred new debate over mandatory break times and hours of service regulations. In addition, the new regulations have changed the way carriers conduct their business. Shippers who delay drivers with significant dwell times are struggling to find decent rates and capacity as the industry adjusts to new demands. Shipper of choice has become the buzz term for what carriers think shippers should aspire to be. In 2017, trucking accounted for $719 billion in total revenue across 15.5 million trucks, which transported 71% of all U.S. goods. By 2018, trucking shipments were outpacing the number of available trucks as the U.S. faces a capacity crisis fueled by a nationwide driver shortage. Over the next decade, trucking revenue is projected to hit $1.25 trillion. In the 2020s, we're likely to see widespread use of new technologies like platooning, autonomous trucks, and digital freight matching services as cargo gets Uberized. As the history of the semi-truck continues to be written, the next chapter in this industry-changing saga could be its most exciting one yet. Now, I'll leave you with some facts and figures on this. There are just under 3.5 million truck drivers in the United States, although for the first time in years that has shrunk, which helps feed into this driver shortage concern that's been going on. Trailers, typically 53 foot long. 1/3 of all semi-trucks operating in the U.S. are registered in California, Florida, and Texas. $41.3 billion, the amount paid by commercial trucks in federal and state highway user taxes in 2015. $450.4 billion, total miles traveled by all registered trucks in 2015. To put that in perspective, the sun is 93 million miles away. Okay, so 450.4 billion total miles divided by 93 million miles. That's a round trip to the sun and back more than 2,421 times. Imagine that. I don't know, that just blows my mind. And it's going to take a lot of gas to do that because trucks get roughly 7.2 miles per gallon, although some of these electric trucks like the Tesla electric semi and things aim to change that. The maximum weight for a U.S. semi-truck and full trailer is 80,000 pounds spread over 18 conventional wheels. Curious, how much power does it take to move a fully loaded semi and trailer? Well, a Detroit diesel DD15 14.8-liter inline 6-cylinder engine weighs 2,880 pounds, or 345 pounds more than a Mini Cooper. This colossal power plant makes up to 560 horsepower, 1,850 feet of torque. Top-selling brands of semi-truck is Freightliner. Freightliner is owned by Daimler Trucks North America, which also owns the Western Star brand. Second most popular is Navistar International, followed by PACCAR, which owns the Peterbilt and Kenworth brands. Fourth is Volvo, which also owns the Mack brand. Anti-lock brakes on semi-trucks have been required since 1997. They have significantly reduced the number of jackknife crashes in which the rear wheels of the truck lock up and the trailer swings around to an acute angle with the truck. Today, the most dangerous semi-accidents are rollovers, and that's when they go across gravel or take turns too sharp and flip over. And that's it for the storied history of the truck. I mean, this amazing invention, every year it's gone under changes. Began as a car carrier. New trailers were built, standardizations came along, and now as we move forward, we're looking into completely new territory like digital platooning and autonomous trucking. It's a brave new world. It's going to be incredibly exciting, and it's coming at a welcome time too, as this capacity crisis has just been heating up. Especially if you've been following this show, we've covered that quite a bit on previous episodes. If you'd like to hear those, you can head over to abornandco.com/podcast. And again, you can find a transcript of this podcast and article at abornandco.com/blog. This has been Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn and Company. For this episode and all of our previous episodes, please visit abornandco.com/podcast or simply search Consulting Logistics on your favorite podcast player. Concerned about elevated supply chain costs in this tough transportation market? Visit abornandco.com to set up a complimentary consultation with one of our managed freight solution experts and learn how we have successfully negotiated over $5 billion in client freight expenses. If you have any questions, comments, requests, and guest bookings, email me at tdooner@abornandco.com. That's TDOONER@abornandco.com. That's it until next week. I'm Tim Dooner for Consulting Logistics, saying take care and happy shipping.